UN Chief Antonio Guterres gave a dire warning at a recent food security summit in New York that Russia's attack on Ukraine could lead to a global hunger crisis lasting years. Before the conflict broke out in late February, both countries accounted for a third of global wheat exports. But today, the world's breadbasket has been cut off. Nearly all of Ukraine's ports are under Russian control. The port of Mariupol, mostly destroyed but now in Russian hands, has been offline since the early days of the attack. Odessa, in Ukraine's southwest, although still under Kiev's control, is being blockaded by Russian warships, denying any commercial vessels a way in or out. That's translating into skyrocketing food prices across the world, where countries dependent on imports panic over future supplies. Many states far from the front lines in Ukraine are enacting their own export bans to secure their own domestic needs. One report from a global think tank on food policy says at least 20 countries have imposed some limit on agricultural exports since February. Has the conflict in Ukraine further exposed the world's fragile food system, and which countries are most at risk? And now I'm joined by Hilal Elver from Santa Barbara, the U.S. She is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and Madeleine Marier, who is a policy advisor on food and agriculture at Oxfam. She is joining us from Amsterdam. Ladies, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Madeleine, the UN has warned that the world's current food shortages could lead to famine in many countries. How have we reached to this point?
First, to say that indeed the situation is exceptionally bad, and around the world, around 180 million people are forecast to be in crisis levels of hunger this year. And in some regions in the world is no less than catastrophic. As we're speaking, one person is likely dying of hunger every 48 seconds in drought-ravaged Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. But how did we get to this point is the crisis in Ukraine is an additional factor that's contributing to a situation that was already bad because people were already suffering from hunger due to climate change, the COVID crisis, and conflict in different regions in the world.
Hilal, would you agree? I mean, we know Ukraine conflict did not start this food security crisis, but how much of it is directly related to do the Russian attack on Ukraine?
I absolutely agree with Madeleine what she said. The food crisis and increasing hunger, especially extreme hunger, famine, is increasing last 6-7 years around the world. But with Ukraine crisis, the staple food of wheat shortages become a very important part, which this is basically what humanitarian aids are, the staple food. They are sending this places like Yemen, Africa, East Africa, places like that that already have serious kind of hunger crisis are happening. So that's the Ukraine crisis made the hunger crisis an important political not only humanitarian, but the political problem. That's why we are hearing right now in almost every platform in the world.
So, Madeleine, the World Food Programme and its partners distributed food and cash to more than 3 million Ukrainians and will soon release $30 million, if I'm not mistaken, to countries like Niger, Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso. How sustainable is this, and does there need to be a more concrete and a long-term solution to help these countries who are suffering from chronic food shortages? What should be done moving forward?
Well, exactly, like you say, it's particular regions in the world that are particularly suffering. And as was said in the introduction, that we have a food shortage worldwide is not actually so. We produce sufficient food in the world to feed the entire world population, but it's an inequality crisis. People can't access the food because they don't have the means to get to it. So again, due to COVID and the economic repercussions, people have lost their incomes, their sources of livelihood. They can't buy the food. And so when you have the humanitarian aid coming in, that is really drastically needed, but that is like sticking plasters on a wound, but you need to heal that wound. You need to tackle the underlying structural causes, which is the fact that the agricultural local support has been neglected for decades, and we really urgently need to start investing in their own agricultural sectors so they become less dependent on importing foods.
So, on the other hand, Russia's attack has not only disrupted food production in Ukraine, Moscow is preventing the transport of crucial agricultural exports that so many rely on. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently spoke specifically about grain supplies piling up in Ukraine because of Russia's blockade. Let's have a listen to what he said, then we'll continue to talk.
As a result of the Russian government's actions, some 20 million tons of grain sit unused in Ukrainian silos as global food supplies dwindle, prices skyrocket, causing more around the world to experience food insecurity.
So, Hilal, in the middle of this, can the world come together and force Russia to allow shipments to move out from Ukraine?
Of course, there is a war situation there, and then it turned out the Black Sea region is very important for the trade, especially grain trade. And the issue is, of course, Russia is trying to block the Ukraine wheat going out, but at the same time, Russia is under sanction by United States and European Union. So I think Russia is playing this card to get out of the sanction in order to start again the trade. 20 million sitting in Ukraine is a serious issue, but considering the entire grain in the world, which we talk about 700 million, is an important part, but not completely. It creates such a crisis, and people are dying from that because Ukraine cannot do the trade. So I think there is some geopolitical game between US, Ukraine, Russia, European Union, and all big players, which these are the big players also. They are controlling wheat. So wheat trade is under the control of the 5-6 countries and 5-6 companies. So that's a kind of important issue I think we have to also consider.
So Madeline, as we've mentioned, with Ukraine's harvest season looming and the huge wheat stockpile just sitting in silos, is there another way to get that grain out instead of by sea?
One would hope so. Another thing I keep on wondering is that we talk about 20 million tons that sit in the silos waiting to be exported. And like the other speaker mentioned, we have 765 million grain production. So actually what I'm wondering is, where else does that grain sit, and how do we get it to the people quickly that need it most? And I think what is lacking actually is market information. Who has the reserves? Where are they located? How do we transport? So again, it's not a problem of production only. Like in the EU, speakers about ramping up production, and we do need eventually in the light of climate change, but that's a long-term issue we need to urgently discuss. But for this very moment, what I'd be interested to know is, where are the reserves other than in the Ukraine? How do we get it to the people? It's about how do we distribute the stocks that are available.
So one report from a global think tank on food security and policy says that at least 20 countries have imposed some limit on agricultural exports since Russia started its attack on Ukraine in February. What's your take on that, Hilal? And how has India's, for example, ban on exports of wheat complicated efforts to address global food security?
Well, of course, the first thing is, when Ukraine cannot do the trade, is there any other alternative routes, alternative places? India came up as an alternative country. Also, China is doing exactly. They have very big time grain, but they are basically using for their own purposes. But India, after 2 days, when they make these promises, they said, "Oh, we have a serious drought problem, so we don't have enough grain for internal use, so we give up." So that's the kind of things that countries are somehow reluctant to bring their already in their places in their hands, basically they are hoarding.
Yes.
And but who is hoarding? And what they said, what our other speakers said, where are they? There is no transparency on that. I think international community should go to this direction rather than asking money, because money is not going to help right now, because many countries are giving right now humanitarians aid more than, for instance, last year or 2 years ago they did during the COVID period. So it's important, kind of, this is a trade issue and not the food shortage issue, but what is the kind of fair trade for everyone, that the people can be fed in times of
Yes.
any time, not only the Ukraine war, actually.
Yes. So, Madeline, how have Russia's attack on Ukraine, COVID-19 pandemic, and the climate crisis exposed the fragile global food system? Does the world need to devise a new supply system where one country or region cannot have this type of impact on food security and supplies?
Well, indeed, it shows time and again how extremely vulnerable we've made ourselves to just relying on a few regions for production and a few big companies for the distribution of the commodities. And what we've been advocating for decades already, and you saw it also at the food price crisis in 2008, where one, you need to address underlying structural causes, because now we look a lot at the supply. Do we produce sufficient? And we do. It's not distributed equally. Another important thing is, where does the demand come from? A lot of our area in the world we use for either biofuels or feedstocks for our meat consumption, particularly in the West. And so what we're saying is you need to back down on that demand. Also, you need to invest in small-scale family farms. They feed a third of the world population. Mm-hmm. If we were to provide these farmers more access to land, more water, infrastructure, markets, then they can produce much more. It will give them a source of income. It would provide their local communities food, and they wouldn't have to rely so much on import markets. Because again, because of the COVID crisis, realize that the debt that countries have gotten themselves in is massive. Now, they can't afford the importing food. They can't afford a social safety net for their population. So we need to cancel these debts as well.
All right, ladies, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.